Welcome to the lecture titled Henry George's Quest to Save Us from Ourselves. I am Edward J. Dodson. During the last quarter of the 19th century, Henry George emerged from out of nowhere to lead a social, political, and economic reform movement that reached the far corners of the globe. This movement gradually faltered after his death in 1897, but survives to attract dedicated adherents to this day, in part because of an increasing attention online to George and his intellectual contributions. Self-taught, he became one of history's greatest political economists and moral philosophers. In his most widely read work, Progress and Poverty, he examined and explained how natural laws of tendency govern the production and distribution of wealth. George argued that we expose ourselves to serious risks by failing to understand these laws. The underlying cause of generational poverty and our cycles of economic boom and bust, and the very real risk of eventual systemic collapse, he traced to human law that redistributed wealth from its producers to non-producing rentier interests, to those who by privilege, force, fraud, and theft claimed wealth for themselves without offering equal values of wealth or services in exchange. Gaining control over land, over nature, he showed was the most effective strategy. What Henry George tried to teach us is today even more important for us to consider than perhaps any time in the history of civilization. Widespread poverty, economic cycles of boom and bust, and systemic failure are, he argued, caused by our failure to establish appropriate legal and institutional structures. In this lecture, I will try to explain why this is the case. Henry George took on the establishment of his era head-on, and he took on the most influential political economists of the 18th and 19th centuries, from Adam Smith and David Ricardo to John Stuart Mill. Of the three, he had the deepest respect for Mill, yet he found Mill unclear and inconsistent in the use of terminology and reasoning. Many pages of his final book, The Science of Political Economy, were devoted to the issues he had with Mill. He found in all works by other writers on political economy significant contradictions and a reluctance to follow logic and the evidence to logical conclusions. In short, he observed that they took pains not to challenge entrenched privilege, which he observed detracted from the scientific character of their work. Only where Karl Marx was concerned was he essentially without criticism, for the simple reason that George did not speak or read German, and not until after George's death was Marx translated into English by Engels. George was even more critical of the Austrians, who introduced to political economy the marginalist revolution and the study of preferences and choices. George also questioned why members of the historical school rejected the existence of universal principles. In The Science of Political Economy, he wrote, "What has succeeded the classical school is usually denominated the Austrian school, for no other reason that I can discover than that far kine have long horns. If it has any principles, I have been utterly unable to find them." Henry George's campaigns against monopoly and rentier privilege attracted supporters in many countries, but his analysis was either ignored or misrepresented by most contemporary political economists and their successor economics professors. The most significant examples of George's critics were compiled in this book, edited by Auburn University professor of philosophy Robert Andelson. One economist whose writings and teaching was built on the foundation provided by Henry George was University of California professor Mason Gaffney. In 1994, Gaffney explained why George's work was deliberately misrepresented by professors beholden for their funding to the leading monopolists of his era. Mason concluded, "The menace George posed to rent takers is clear from how he viewed them. To George, the landowner per se is non-functional. Worse yet, landowners become triple dippers when they use their discretionary income and wealth to dominate politics and drain away yet more treasure through subsidies, public works and services, protections from competition, cheap credit, and so on. Often, they are not just passive drones, but active predators. As to the academic clerisy, George first suspected and then impugned their motives. They were myrmidons of the rent-takers, using smoke and mirrors to addle, baffle, boggle, and dazzle the lady. The inevitable counterattack came to be called neoclassical economics, as though it were simply a natural development and improvement of tried and true classical economics. Rent-taking had to be made to appear useful in functional economic terms. The classical underpinnings of George had to be undone in a fairly subtle way to seem simply evolutionary. Mason Gaffney spent a good deal of time over his long life. He died in 2020 at age 97, writing and speaking on behalf of Henry George's contributions to the understanding of the dynamics of land markets and to the boom-to-bust cycles that plague us. Insights he and at least a handful of other economists recognized as essential to the discipline. Summing up, Mason Gaffney wrote, "The recent harvest of neoclassical economics and its derived public policies is a worsening condition of labor, lower returns to savings, high and rising concentration of wealth and income, rising class divisions and social problems, and a fall of national stature. It should be enough to make us realize that neoclassical economics, forged as a stratagem to discomfort Henry George and Georgius, is intellectually, morally, and practically bankrupt." If Mason Gaffney were here speaking to you today, I expect he would support the contention that the economic theory and the teaching of economics to several generations of students has suffered because Henry George's contributions were suppressed, then replaced by neoclassical economics. Henry George's one interview for a university faculty position at the newly established University of California did not go well. Addressing the university faculty and the student body in 1877, he said this: "The very importance of the subjects with which political economy deals raises obstacles in its way. The discoveries of other sciences may challenge pernicious ideas, but the conclusions of political economy involve pecuniary interests and thus thrill directly the sensitive pocket nerve. What then must be the opposition which inevitably meets a science that deals with tariffs and subsidies, with banking interests and bonded debts, with trade unions and combinations of capital, with taxes and licenses and land tenures? It is not ignorance alone that offers opposition, but ignorance backed by interest and made fierce by passions." And if those statements were not enough to remove George from consideration, he added this: "If there were nothing more to be urged in favor of the study of political economy than the mental exercise it will give, it would still be worth your profoundest attention. The study which will teach men to think for themselves is the study of all studies most needed. Education is not the learning of facts. It is the development and training of mental powers. All this array of professors, all this paraphernalia of learning cannot educate a man. They can but help him to educate himself. Here you may obtain the tools, but they will be useful only to him who can use them. A monkey with a telescope, a mule packing a library, are fit emblems of the men, and unfortunately they are plenty, who pass through the whole educational machinery and come out but learned fools, crammed with knowledge which they cannot use, all the more pitiable, all the more contemptible, all the more in the way of real progress, because they pass with themselves and others as educated men." To his credit, Henry George was motivated by a far deeper calling than to obtain standing within academe. He sought to bring an end to institutionalized injustices that prevented the promise of democracy from being fulfilled. As he came to the last few chapters of Progress and Poverty, he offered a sobering forecast of how modern civilization might decline. He wrote, "What has destroyed every previous civilization has been the tendency to the unequal distribution of wealth and power. This same tendency, operating with increasing force, is observable in our civilization today, showing itself in every progressive community and with greater intensity the more progressive the community." In his book Social Problems, published in 1883, he warned that history could well repeat if human behavior failed to evolve. More is given to us than to any people at any time before, and therefore more is required of us. We have made and still are making enormous advances on material lines. It is necessary that we commensurately advance on moral lines. Civilization, as it progresses, requires a higher conscience, a keener sense of justice, a warmer brotherhood, a wider, loftier, truer public spirit. Failing these, civilizations must pass into destruction. In the final chapter, titled "The Function of Government," George urged that the people give far more attention to the operation of government. To prevent government from becoming corrupt and tyrannous, its organization and methods should be as simple as possible. Its functions be restricted to those necessary to the common welfare, and in all its parts it should be kept as close to the people and as directly within their control as may be. Our challenge has been to identify and then work to obtain implementation of changes in how we are governed that both secure and protect individual liberty while meeting our collective needs as a society. Importantly, George went on to explain that more, not less, responsibility would be falling on government as population increased, as technology advanced, and as the peoples of the world become increasingly interconnected. Instead of belittling the dangers of adding to the functions of government as it is at present, what I am endeavoring to point out is the urgent necessity of simplifying and improving government, that it may safely assume the additional functions that social development forces upon it. So, was he right? One might ask, if he was right, how has civilization managed to survive for more than a century and a quarter after he took his last breath? Without doubt, material progress has been advancing at an accelerating pace, with astounding increases in the quantity and quality of wealth produced for consumption by a global population that is today, at nearly 8 billion people, 4 times greater than it was in 1900. And yet, depending on how one measures living standards, poverty remains as a seemingly unsolvable problem in almost every country. Debate is continuous over the extent to which poverty is the result of individual behavior, life decisions, and misfortune, or the result of systemic injustices. Henry George would today be pointing to the statistics that show an increasing level of landlessness, correlated with the escalating concentrated control over nature and the locations where people live, work, and engage in other activities. A few hundred people and a small number of corporations claim ownership of most of the privately held land around the world. As millions of people moved from rural to urban communities, those at the bottom merely traded the payment of ground rent to absentee landowners, or a share of the crops produced, for the payment of housing rent to absentee slumlords. The end result is the same: hardly enough disposable income for a subsistence living. What might Henry George's last words be as he surveyed our current conditions? In 1897, he was again drafted to stand for election to the office of mayor of New York City. What he stated at the start of that campaign could be repeated today. Though we may not speak it openly, the general faith in democratic institutions, where they have reached their fullest development, is narrowing and weakening. It is no longer the confident belief in democracy as the source of national blessings that it once was. Strong, unscrupulous men rising up upon occasion will become the exponents of blind popular desires of fierce popular passions and dash aside reforms that have lost their vitality. The sword will again be mightier than the pen, and in carnivals of destruction, brute force and wild frenzy will alternate with lethargy of a declining civilization. And finally, Henry George concludes, the evils arising from the unjust and unequal distribution of wealth are not incidents of progress, but tendencies that must bring progress to a halt. They will not cure themselves, but on the contrary must, unless their cause is removed, grow greater and greater until they sweep us back into barbarism by the road every previous civilization has trod. Well, what more is there to say? Well, I'll end with comments by two people who read and studied Henry George thoroughly, John Dewey and Leo Tolstoy. And here's what John Dewey has to say about Henry George. Dewey writes, in spite of the immense circulation of George's writings, the full sweep of George's ideas is not at all adequately grasped by the American public, not even by that part which has experienced what we call a higher education. Henry George is one of a small number of definitely original social philosophers that the world has produced. Hence, this lack of knowledge of the wider and deeper aspects of his thinking marks a great intellectual loss. And from Leo Tolstoy, Henry George's scheme, which overturns the whole order of life of the nations for the benefit of the crushed, voiceless majority and to the prejudice of the ruling minority, is set forth with such convincing and irrefutable arguments, and above all so simply, that it is impossible not to understand it. And having once understood, one cannot help trying to carry it into effect. And that brings me to the end. I thank you.